Montana Territory, 1878. The town of Silverdale rested like a weathered saddle between two mountain ridges, its dusty main street bustling with the peculiar mix of determination and desperation that defined frontier settlements. The air carried the scent of pine from the surrounding forests, mingling with wood smoke and the ever-present dust of the cattle trails. It was a place where fortunes could change with a single card game and where a man's past often chased him westward like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. Jackson Quinn dismounted his dappled gray gelding in front of the general store, his lean frame moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. At 25, he'd already seen enough of the West's brutality to harden his gaze and set his jaw in a permanent line of caution. His face remained youthful despite the weathering of trail dust and mountain sun, handsome in a way that drew second glances from women in the settlements he passed through, with clear blue eyes that revealed little of his thoughts. The light stubble on his face was the result of days on the trail rather than intention, and would be gone by morning. Jackson had learned early that attachments were dangerous in territories where law was still more suggestion than reality. Every friendship formed meant one more person to grieve when violence inevitably claimed them. Every connection built was another potential wound waiting to happen. The frontier had taught him a simple truth. Lone wolves survived where pack animals fell to hunters' bullets. "Quinn, you ornery son of a gun," the booming voice of Walter Simmons, the local blacksmith, cut through Jackson's thoughts. "Didn't expect to see you back before the first snow." Jackson tipped his hat, a brief smile warming his features before the customary guard returned. Cattle drive finished early. "Thought I'd winter here instead of pushing on to Colorado." What he didn't say was that Silverdale was the closest thing to home he'd known in the 6 years since leaving Missouri. He'd found occasional work with the Double R Ranch outside town, breaking horses and driving cattle when the seasons demanded it. The rest of the time he kept to himself, taking odd jobs and sleeping under stars when weather permitted. "Well, Mrs. Simmons will be pleased, says you're too skinny by half," Walter laughed, clapping Jackson on the shoulder with enough force to stagger a smaller man. Jackson nodded politely, making noncommittal promises about stopping by for supper sometime before excusing himself. The truth was, Walter's wife's mothering only reminded him of what he'd lost, of the family buried back east and the life that had died with them. The frontier was no place for putting down roots. A man survived by keeping moving, by not giving fate a stationary target. He led his horse to the livery stable, arranged for boarding, and headed toward the Silverdale Hotel with his saddlebag slung over one shoulder. A hot bath and a real bed would be his first luxuries after months on the trail. As he crossed the street, the afternoon stagecoach rumbled into town, churning dust into the air and bringing the usual commotion of arrivals. Jackson might have paid it no mind, except for the flash of emerald green that caught his eye as passengers began to disembark. She stepped down from the coach with grace that seemed wildly out of place in the rugged settlement. Her dress, though travel-worn, was clearly of fine quality, the deep green fabric complementing chestnut hair that fell in careful waves beneath a modest hat. At perhaps 20 years old, her face held the softness of youth, but with eyes that suggested she'd seen more of life's hardships than most women her age. Their gazes met briefly across the dusty street, and Jackson felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. He quickly looked away, reminding himself that curious strangers only brought complications. "Miss Zanetti," the stagecoach driver called out, struggling with a trunk, "where would you like your baggage taken?" "The boarding house, please." "Mrs. Holloway is expecting me," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent Jackson couldn't quite place. He continued toward the hotel, pushing the encounter from his mind. Beautiful women appeared in frontier towns for all manner of reasons, most of them involving fresh starts or escaping something. None of it was his business, yet as he signed the hotel register, he found himself asking the clerk, "Who's the young woman who just arrived on the stage?" The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, glanced out the window. "That's Miss Grace Zanetti, came all the way from New York, I hear. Mrs. Holloway hired her to teach at the school starting this winter." He gave Jackson a knowing look. "Pretty thing, ain't she? Half the unmarried men in town will be finding reasons to visit the schoolhouse come next month." Jackson grunted noncommittally and took his room key. Teachers, like preachers and lawmen, represented civilization's advance, the very thing that had driven him westward in the first place. Wherever schools appeared, fences and property lines followed. The wild places grew smaller. He settled into his room, stripped off his trail-worn clothes, and made his way to the bathhouse behind the hotel. As he soaked away weeks of dust and cattle grime, he found his thoughts wandering back to Miss Zanetti's face. There was something about her eyes, a wariness that seemed at odds with her refined appearance. Later that evening, while taking supper in the hotel dining room, Jackson caught himself watching the entrance, half expecting her to appear. When she didn't, he berated himself for the foolish distraction. He had wintering preparations to make, perhaps work to secure. A schoolteacher from back east had no place in those plans. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of autumn's chill in the air. Jackson set about his business in town, arranging for supplies and inquiring about work opportunities for the coming months. He just finished securing a position breaking horses for a neighboring ranch when he turned the corner and nearly collided with Miss Zanetti outside the mercantile. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, stepping back quickly and tipping his hat. She clutched a small parcel to her chest, looking momentarily startled before composing herself. "No harm done, Mr. Quinn," he supplied, "Jackson Quinn." "Grace Zanetti." She offered her hand in a surprisingly forthright gesture for a woman of apparent refinement. "I believe I saw you yesterday when I arrived." Jackson hesitated before taking her hand. Her grip was firmer than he expected, and as her sleeve pulled back slightly, he noticed a leather bracelet circling her wrist. Something about the way she quickly adjusted her sleeve suggested she preferred to keep it covered. "You'll be teaching at the school, I hear," he said, releasing her hand. She nodded, a genuine smile warming her features. "Yes. The children deserve education, even out here, perhaps especially out here." "The West has its own lessons to teach," Jackson replied, more curtly than he'd intended. Rather than taking offense, Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him with unexpected intensity. "I don't doubt it, Mr. Quinn, but I've found that books and wilderness can coexist quite well." Her response caught him off guard, as did the quiet confidence behind it. Before he could reply, Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house proprietor, called Grace's name from across the street. "If you'll excuse me," Grace said with a small nod, "perhaps we'll continue this debate another time." Jackson watched her go, inexplicably annoyed at both her assumption that there would be a next time and at his own desire for exactly that. He'd made it a point to avoid entanglements of any kind, especially with women who represented the civilizing forces that were slowly taming the frontier. Yet over the next 2 weeks, their paths crossed with surprising frequency in the small town. Each encounter left Jackson increasingly intrigued and increasingly wary. Grace Zanetti was clearly educated and well-bred, yet she navigated frontier life with unexpected adaptability. She spoke to everyone from the banker to the livery boy with the same genuine interest, and though she maintained proper decorum, there was nothing pretentious in her manner. Most puzzling to Jackson was the way she seemed both open and guarded simultaneously. She shared stories of New York and her teaching experiences freely, yet revealed almost nothing about her family or what had drawn her to Montana Territory specifically. One afternoon, Jackson was mending tack on the front porch of the livery when he spotted Grace walking toward the small creek that ran behind town, a book tucked under her arm. Without fully understanding his own motivation, he found himself following at a distance. She settled beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves just beginning to turn golden with the season. For several minutes, Jackson simply watched from the cover of some willows as she read, occasionally marking passages or making notes in the margins. There was something peaceful in the scene that tugged at long-forgotten places in his heart. His boot dislodged a stone, sending it tumbling into the creek with a splash that caused Grace to look up sharply. "Who's there?" she called, closing her book and rising to her feet in one fluid motion. Jackson stepped into view, embarrassment heating his face. "Sorry for startling you, Miss Zanetti. I was just taking a walk." Her expression shifted from alarm to mild amusement. "You have an unusually quiet step for a man in boots, Mr. Quinn." "Habit from hunting," he explained, approaching slowly. "What are you reading that's worth risking snakes by the creek?" She held up the book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, words that make even more sense out here than they did back east. Jackson raised an eyebrow skeptically, and to his surprise, she opened the book and began to read. "Not I, not anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it for yourself. It is not far, it is within reach. Perhaps you have been on it since you were born and did not know." Her voice carried the words with such conviction that Jackson found himself momentarily transfixed. As she looked up from the page, sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling her face with patterns of light and shadow. "You believe that," he asked quietly, "that everyone has their own path?" Grace closed the book carefully. I've seen enough to know that the roads we think we should travel aren't always the ones meant for us. She studied him with those discerning eyes. Haven't you found the same, Mr. Quinn? The question struck uncomfortably close to thoughts he preferred to leave unexamined. Before he could formulate a response, she continued, "You've been watching me since I arrived. I'd like to know why." The directness of her question left him momentarily speechless. "I'm not," he began, then stopped himself from the obvious lie. "You're different from most who come through here." "As are you," she countered. "Most cowboys don't quote Whitman." "I didn't quote anything," he pointed out. "No, but you recognized it," Grace smiled. "Your eyes changed when I read those lines." Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "I had a mother who believed in education, even for boys destined for ranch work." Grace nodded, accepting this small offering of personal history without pushing for more. "I should return to town before Mrs. Holloway sends a search party. Would you care to walk with me, Mr. Quinn?" Against his better judgment, he fell into step beside her. Their conversation as they walked was surprisingly easy, touching on the approaching winter, the town's preparations, and the horses Jackson was breaking. Yet beneath the casual exchange ran an undercurrent of mutual assessment, as if each was trying to solve a puzzle presented by the other. When they reached the boarding house, Grace turned to face him. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Quinn." "Jackson," he said, surprising himself. "Most folks just call me Jackson." "Then I suppose I'm Grace," she replied with a smile that briefly transformed her face, revealing dimples he hadn't noticed before. She extended her hand again, and as they shook, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal not only the leather bracelet he'd glimpsed before but also a distinct mark beneath it, a small, crescent-shaped scar on the inside of her wrist. Something about that mark triggered a memory so powerful that Jackson nearly gasped aloud. But before he could process the thought, Grace had withdrawn her hand and bid him good afternoon, disappearing into the boarding house. Jackson stood frozen on the boardwalk, his mind racing backward through time to cattle drive 2 years earlier. To a desperate man named Henry Zanetti who joined their outfit in Colorado, claiming to be searching for his missing daughter. A man who'd shown Jackson a distinctive family heirloom, a leather bracelet with silver conchos, and described a crescent-shaped birthmark on his daughter's wrist, the very same mark he'd just seen on Grace. That night, Jackson lay awake in his hotel room, turning the implications over in his mind. Henry Zanetti had been pursuing his daughter all the way from New York, claiming she'd been coerced into leaving by a man with unsavory connections. He'd been frantic, showing her photograph to everyone they encountered along the trail. Jackson remembered the photograph clearly, a younger Grace, perhaps 17, her expression serious as she posed in formal attire. Henry had ridden with them for nearly a month before tragedy struck. A river crossing gone wrong, a horse panicking, and Henry had been swept downstream, his body recovered 2 days later. Jackson had kept the man's few possessions, intending to send them to the New York address Henry had provided if his daughter was ever found, but the letter he'd written had been returned unopened. And now here she was in the same small Montana town where Jackson had chosen to winter. The coincidence seemed too great to be mere chance, yet he couldn't fathom what it might mean. By morning, Jackson had made his decision. He would approach Grace directly, tell her about meeting her father, and deliver the small bundle of belongings he'd stored in his saddlebags for 2 years. Whatever her reasons for leaving New York, she deserved to know her father had searched for her until his dying breath. But when he arrived at the boarding house after breakfast, Mrs. Holloway informed him that Grace had ridden out with the blacksmith's son to visit the schoolhouse and prepare it for the coming term. She wouldn't return until afternoon. Restless, Jackson retrieved the small package of Henry Zanetti's effects from his hotel room and examined them again. A pocket watch, a folded letter addressed simply to "my dearest daughter," and a small daguerreotype of a woman who shared Grace's features, presumably her mother. Nothing that explained why Grace had fled New York or why her father had been so desperate to find her. The waiting proved unbearable. Jackson saddled his horse and rode out to the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building that sat at the edge of town. As he approached, he could see 2 horses hitched outside, confirming Grace's presence. He dismounted, straightened his vest, and ran a hand through his hair before approaching the open door. Inside, Grace was standing on a chair, pinning a map of the United States to the wall while young Tommy Simmons, the blacksmith's 16-year-old son, steadied the chair. "Good morning," Jackson called from the doorway. Grace turned, surprise evident in her expression. "Mr. Quinn, Jackson, what brings you out this way?" Need to speak with you, he said, then nodded to Tommy. Privately, if possible. Tommy looked between them with poorly concealed interest before Grace smiled at him. Tommy, would you mind fetching more water from the creek? The bucket's nearly empty, and I'll need to clean the slates next. Once the boy had gone, Grace stepped down from the chair and faced Jackson, her expression guarded. Is something wrong? Jackson took a deep breath. I know who you are, Miss Zanetti, and I know why that bracelet you wear is so important to you. Her face paled visibly, and her hand moved instinctively to cover her wrist. I don't know what you're talking about. 2 years ago, I met your father on a cattle drive out of Colorado, Jackson continued gently. Henry Zanetti. He was searching for his daughter who'd left New York. He showed everyone your photograph. He described the birthmark on your wrist, that crescent shape I saw yesterday. Grace sank slowly into one of the student desks, her composure cracking. My father, he followed me here. To Montana. Jackson nodded, pulling the small package from his pocket and placing it on the desk before her. He rode with us for nearly a month. Jackson hesitated, unsure how to deliver the news. He's dead, isn't he? Grace asked quietly, her fingers hovering over the package without touching it. There was an accident at a river crossing. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sagging with a grief that seemed complex. When she looked up again, there was a sheen of tears, but also something like resignation in her gaze. Did he tell you why I left New York? Jackson shook his head, only that he believed you'd been coerced somehow. That he needed to find you and bring you home. A bitter laugh escaped her. Of course that's what he told you. She finally picked up the package, her fingers tracing the edges without opening it. My father was not the man you thought you knew, Mr. Quinn. Before she could elaborate, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the door. Tommy had returned, but he wasn't alone. 3 riders accompanied him, their expressions grim. Miss Zanetti, called the lead rider, a hard-faced man with a weathered appearance that spoke of years in the saddle, found you at last. Jackson moved instinctively to place himself between Grace and the doorway, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. Can I help you, gentlemen? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. The lead rider dismounted, spurs jingling as he approached the schoolhouse. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. Our business is with the lady. Grace had risen to her feet, her face drained of color. How did you find me, Reeves? Your father had friends in many places, the man called Reeves replied with a cold smile. Even here in Montana territory, when word reached us about a young teacher matching your description, well, he spread his hands. Here we are. You have no authority here, Grace said, her voice steadier than her pale complexion suggested she felt. Jackson remained perfectly still, assessing the 3 men. All were armed, their hands resting too casually near their weapons. This wasn't a social call. Mr. Preston would disagree, Reeves said. He's still waiting to honor the arrangement your father made. Very patiently, I might add, considering you've kept him waiting 2 years. Arrangement? Jackson asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the men in the doorway. My father arranged my marriage to Everett Preston before I was even 18, Grace said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. A business merger disguised as a wedding. Preston is nearly 50 and has buried 2 wives already. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Grace hadn't been abducted or coerced into leaving, she'd fled an unwanted marriage arranged by her father. And Henry Zanetti's pursuit had not been the desperate search of a loving father, but the actions of a man determined to enforce his will. The lady isn't interested, Jackson said firmly. I suggest you gentlemen ride on. Reeves laughed, a sound devoid of humor. And who might you be to decide that? Someone who doesn't take kindly to 3 armed men threatening a schoolteacher, Jackson replied evenly. The tension in the small schoolroom was palpable. Tommy Simmons stood forgotten near his horse, eyes wide with the understanding that he was witnessing something dangerous. Tommy, Jackson called without looking away from Reeves, ride back to town. Tell your father and Sheriff Miller we have visitors at the schoolhouse. The boy didn't need to be told twice. He mounted his horse and galloped toward town, spurring harder than the poor animal deserved. Reeves watched him go with narrowed eyes before turning back to Jackson and Grace. This doesn't have to get messy. Miss Zanetti comes with us, fulfills her father's contract, and everyone parts ways peacefully. I am not property to be traded, Grace said, stepping forward to stand beside Jackson. And my father's contract died with him. Jackson felt a surge of admiration for her courage even as he calculated their odds against three armed men. His revolver held 6 shots, and he had extra ammunition in his pocket, but a firefight in the confined space of the schoolhouse would be chaotic and dangerous. "You're outnumbered," Reeves pointed out, "and Mr. Preston is not a patient man. He's offered $1,000 to whoever brings you back to New York." "Then he's wasting his money," Jackson said. He shifted subtly, angling his body to present a smaller target while keeping Grace partially shielded behind him. The standoff might have erupted into violence then if not for the distant sound of multiple riders approaching. Reeves glanced over his shoulder, clearly reconsidering his position as at least 5 mounted men appeared on the horizon, led by Walter Simmons and Sheriff Miller. "This isn't over," Reeves said, backing toward the door. "We'll be watching, Miss Zanetti. You can't hide forever." The 3 men mounted quickly and rode off in the opposite direction from the approaching townspeople, disappearing over a ridge before the sheriff's party arrived. Once the immediate danger had passed and explanations had been made to the sheriff, Jackson escorted Grace back to town. She remained silent for much of the journey, the package of her father's belongings clutched tightly in her hands. "Thank you," she finally said as they approached the boarding house. "You placed yourself in danger for someone you barely know." Jackson shrugged uncomfortably, couldn't let them bully a schoolteacher. "Bad for the town's reputation." The attempt at humor fell flat, and Grace stopped walking to face him directly. "Why did you really come looking for me today, Mr. Quinn?" "To tell me about my father, yes, but there must be more to it." The directness of her question caught him off guard. Jackson looked away, studying the distant mountains as he gathered his thoughts. "Your father spoke about you every day during that drive," he finally said. "Showed your picture to anyone who'd look, I thought." He paused, aware of how foolish it sounded now that he knew the truth. "I thought he was a desperate father searching for his beloved daughter. That maybe I could finish what he started by finding you, telling you how much he cared." Grace's expression softened. "And now that you know the real reason he was searching for me." "Now I understand why you left," Jackson said simply. "No one should be forced into marriage, especially not to a man old enough to be their father." They resumed walking, the silence between them more comfortable now. When they reached the boarding house, Grace turned to him once more. "They won't give up, Reeves and his men. $1,000 is a fortune out here." Jackson nodded grimly. "The sheriff will keep an eye out for them, but you're right. They'll be back." Grace squared her shoulders, a determination in her stance that reminded Jackson of why he'd been drawn to her from the beginning. "I won't run again. I've spent 2 years building a new life, and Silverdale needs a teacher." "Then we'll figure something out," Jackson said, surprising himself with the ease of including himself in her problems. That night, unable to sleep, Jackson sat on the edge of his bed examining the choices before him. The sensible option was to distance himself from Grace Zanetti and her troubles. He had secured work for the winter, had plans to save enough money to possibly stake a small claim in the spring. Getting involved with a woman being hunted by determined men would only complicate matters. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw her standing brave and defiant in the schoolhouse, refusing to be treated as property even with guns potentially trained on her. She embodied a courage and determination that resonated with something long dormant within him. By morning, Jackson had made his decision. He would help Grace deal with Reeves and his men, then continue with his original plans. It was the decent thing to do, nothing more. He told himself this firmly as he walked to the sheriff's office after breakfast, but the lie felt hollow even in his own mind. Sheriff Miller was a practical man who had maintained peace in Silverdale through a combination of fairness and the clear willingness to use force when necessary. He listened carefully as Jackson outlined his concerns about Reeves and his men returning. "Can't post a deputy at the schoolhouse indefinitely," Miller said, stroking his gray mustache thoughtfully. "But I can increase patrols for a while, maybe ask some of the ranchers to keep an eye out for strangers." "What about legal protection?" Jackson asked. "If her father arranged this marriage, is there any way to formally invalidate it now that he's dead?" The sheriff shrugged. "That's lawyer business, not mine. Nearest real attorney is in Helena, and even then, contracts between New York parties might not fall under territorial jurisdiction." Jackson thanked him and left, his mind working through other possibilities. As he crossed the street, he nearly collided with Grace, who was emerging from the mercantile. "We need to talk," they said simultaneously, then shared a brief, awkward smile. "The boarding house parlor is private," Grace suggested. Mrs. Holloway is visiting her sister in the next town over. Once seated in the modest but comfortable parlor, Grace wasted no time. I've been thinking about our situation all night. There's really only one solution that makes sense. Our situation, Jackson echoed, caught by the phrasing, a flush colored Grace's cheeks. My situation, I should say. Though you've involved yourself rather thoroughly already. Jackson waited, curious about the solution she'd devised. I need to disappear again, she said, her voice steady despite the disappointment evident in her eyes. Change my name, move to another territory, perhaps California this time. Running didn't solve the problem last time, Jackson pointed out. What's to stop them from finding you again? Grace sighed, twisting the leather bracelet on her wrist. Nothing, I suppose. But I don't see another option. I can't fight men like Reeves and Preston forever. Jackson leaned forward, choosing his next words carefully. What if there was a way to make the contract unenforceable? If Preston wants to marry you because of some business arrangement with your father, then he would have no claim if I were already married, Grace finished, her eyes widening. But that would require a husband, Jackson said simply. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Grace studied his face intently, as if searching for some hidden motive. Are you suggesting? Jackson stood and paced the small room, suddenly uncomfortable with sitting still. It would be a marriage on paper only, he hastened to clarify. A legal protection. Once Reeves and Preston give up, we could quietly dissolve it and go our separate ways. And you would do this for me? Why? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the question Jackson had been asking himself all night, and he still didn't have a satisfactory answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. Because no one should be forced into marriage against their will. Grace rose to stand before him, her expression unreadable. That's very noble, Mr. Quinn, but marriage, even one of convenience, is not something to enter into lightly. You would be binding yourself to a woman you barely know, with complications you've only glimpsed. I know enough, Jackson said quietly. I know you're brave enough to flee across the country rather than submit to an unwanted fate. I know you care enough about children you've never met to risk bringing danger to a small town, and I know you stood your ground against armed men yesterday without flinching. A smile touched Grace's lips. You make me sound far more heroic than I am. Perhaps we both need to see ourselves through each other's eyes occasionally, Jackson replied. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the outline of her bracelet. Finally, she spoke. If, and I stress if, we were to consider this arrangement, there would need to be clear terms. This would be a temporary solution with no expectations beyond the legal protection it provides. Jackson nodded, agreed. And we would need a believable story, she continued. The town cannot know this is a marriage of convenience. It would raise too many questions. We could say we met during my travels, Jackson suggested. Corresponded by letter. When you took the teaching position here, it seemed like fate. Grace's expression softened slightly. You have an unexpected romantic streak, Mr. Quinn. Jackson, he corrected. If we're discussing marriage, you should probably use my given name. The word marriage hung in the air between them, somehow more real now that it had been spoken aloud a second time. Grace took a deep breath and extended her hand formally. Very well, Jackson, I accept your proposal with the terms as discussed. He took her hand, noting the slight tremor in her fingers despite her composed expression. I'll speak with the preacher today. The sooner this is official, the better. As Jackson left the boarding house, he felt as though he'd stepped off a cliff, unsure whether the fall would be brief or endless. He'd just proposed marriage to a woman he barely knew, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The logical part of his mind insisted this was simply a practical solution to a dangerous problem. The arrangement would be temporary, the commitment limited. Yet beneath that rationalization ran a current of truth he wasn't ready to examine, that Grace Zanetti had awakened something in him he'd thought long buried beneath years of solitude and self-protection. Reverend Thomas was understandably surprised by Jackson's request for an immediate wedding, but after some explanation, carefully edited to protect Grace's privacy, he agreed to perform the ceremony the following day. The story they created, of a courtship conducted largely through letters after a chance meeting during Jackson's travels, was simple enough to be believable while explaining the seemingly sudden nature of their marriage. That evening, Jackson found himself standing awkwardly in the boarding house parlor again, finalizing details with Grace. Mrs. Holloway, having returned from her sister's, hovered nearby, clearly delighted by the romantic development under her roof. "It's just like a novel," she exclaimed, arranging flowers in a vase. "Secret correspondence leading to marriage. I always thought you two would make a handsome couple, even before I knew of your history together." Grace smiled politely while shooting Jackson a look that clearly communicated her discomfort with the deception. "Mrs. Holloway has kindly offered to be our witness tomorrow, along with Sheriff Miller. The whole town will want to celebrate," Mrs. Holloway continued. "First wedding we've had in months. I'll speak with the ladies' auxiliary about arranging a small reception." When Mrs. Holloway finally left them alone for a moment, Grace whispered urgently, "This is already growing beyond our control. A reception means more witnesses, more people invested in our marriage. It also means more public recognition of our union," Jackson pointed out. "The more people who know you're married to a local man, the less likely Reeves will be to make another attempt." Grace couldn't argue with the logic, though her expression remained troubled. "What about after? Have you considered what this means for your future, for your freedom?" The question struck closer to Jackson's fears than he cared to admit. He had spent years avoiding attachments precisely because they represented constraint, obligation, vulnerability. Even this temporary arrangement would tie him to Silverdale in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'll manage," he said simply, "one winter at a time." The following morning dawned clear and cold, with the first dusting of snow on the distant peaks. Jackson dressed with unusual care in his best shirt and the dark vest he rarely wore. He'd had his hair trimmed at the barber's and had splurged on a new hat, small details that seemed important though he couldn't have explained why. At the appointed hour, he made his way to the small white church at the edge of town. Despite the hasty arrangements, word had spread quickly, and several townspeople nodded knowingly as he passed. By the time he reached the church steps, Jackson realized their small, private ceremony had evolved into something of a community event. Inside, the simple wooden pews were already half filled with curious townspeople. Reverend Thomas waited at the altar, a knowing smile beneath his gray beard. Sheriff Miller stood to one side, his presence both official and supportive. Jackson took his place at the front, fighting the urge to tug at his collar, which suddenly felt too tight. The murmur of conversation behind him ceased abruptly, and he turned to see Grace entering on the arm of Walter Simmons, who had apparently been pressed into service to give away the bride. Her dress wasn't white, there had been no time for such preparations, but the deep blue of her best dress complemented her chestnut hair, which had been arranged in an elegant style with small white flowers woven through the braids. She moved with composed dignity down the short aisle, her eyes fixed on Jackson with an expression that masterfully blended appropriate shyness with apparent affection. As she took her place beside him, Jackson caught the faint scent of lavender. "You look beautiful," he whispered, the words escaping before he could consider their sincerity. "Thank you," she replied softly. "You clean up rather well yourself, Cowboy." The ceremony itself was brief, the traditional words taking on an unexpected weight as Jackson repeated them. When the time came to exchange rings, he produced a simple gold band he'd purchased that morning from the jeweler's meager selection. Grace's surprise was genuine as he slipped it onto her finger. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "You may kiss your bride." This moment, which they'd somehow failed to discuss in their planning, suddenly loomed with awkward significance. Jackson hesitated briefly before leaning forward and placing a gentle, chaste kiss on Grace's lips. It lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, he felt a jolt of connection that left him momentarily disoriented. The small congregation erupted in applause and well wishes, surrounding them as they made their way back down the aisle. Outside, they found themselves the center of an impromptu celebration, with townspeople offering congratulations and the ladies of the auxiliary already setting up tables for a reception in the church yard. For the next several hours, they played their parts with increasing ease, accepting good wishes and sharing carefully crafted stories of their courtship. Grace's natural charm and Jackson's quiet steadiness complemented each other, making their sudden marriage seem less surprising to those who observed them together. As the afternoon waned and the celebration began to disperse, they were faced with the reality they'd created. They were in every legal sense husband and wife, and now they needed to determine what that meant in practical terms. "I've taken a room at the hotel for tonight," Jackson said quietly as they walked toward the boarding house to collect Grace's belongings. "I thought it best to maintain appearances." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. And after that, I can't continue living at the boarding house as a married woman. I've been thinking about that, Jackson admitted. There's a small cabin available for rent on the edge of town. It's modest, but it would serve our purposes. 2 rooms, so you'd have your privacy. The relief in Grace's eyes was evident. That sounds suitable. Thank you for considering the practicalities.
Mrs.
Holloway fussed over them as Grace packed her few possessions, insisting on sending along extra blankets and a basket of food for the newlyweds. Her knowing winks made Grace blush and Jackson clear his throat uncomfortably, but they maintained their facade until finally escaping to the hotel. The hotel clerk's barely concealed smirk as he handed over the key to the best room made Jackson's ears burn. This charade had aspects he hadn't fully considered in the rush to provide Grace with protection. Inside the room, an awkward silence fell between them. The large bed dominated the space, decorated with a quilt that Mrs. Peterson, the hotel owner's wife, had clearly provided specially for the occasion. "I'll sleep in the chair," Jackson said immediately, placing Grace's carpet bag on the bed. "You take the bed." "Don't be ridiculous," Grace replied practically. "The chair will leave you cramped and useless tomorrow. The bed is large enough that we can both use it without impropriety." Jackson raised an eyebrow at her pragmatism. "Are you certain?" "We're both adults, Jackson, and this arrangement was my decision as much as yours. I won't have you sleeping in discomfort because of outdated notions of propriety in a marriage that is, after all, a legal fiction." Her directness startled a laugh from him. "You're not what I expected, Grace Zanetti Quinn." She smiled at the new name. "I could say the same about you. Most men wouldn't put themselves in this position for a stranger's sake." "Perhaps we're not strangers anymore," Jackson said quietly. Grace held his gaze for a moment before turning to unpack her nightclothes. "Perhaps not." That night they lay side by side in the large bed, a careful distance maintained between them. Despite the physical gap, Jackson felt more connected to another human being than he had in years. The steady sound of Grace's breathing eventually lulled him into sleep, his last conscious thought being surprise at how natural it felt to have her there. The following days established a routine that gradually began to feel like a real marriage rather than the pretense they'd created. They moved into the small cabin, which Grace quickly transformed with small touches: curtains at the windows, wildflowers in jars, books stacked neatly on every available surface. Jackson found himself looking forward to returning there each evening after working with horses at the neighboring ranch. Grace began teaching at the schoolhouse, quickly becoming a favorite among both children and parents in Silverdale. Her intelligence and genuine interest in her students' progress earned her respect throughout the community. In the evenings, she would often read aloud from one of her books while Jackson cleaned his tack or whittled small animals that gradually populated the cabin's shelves. Sheriff Miller reported no sign of Reeves or his men, though he maintained extra patrols for the first few weeks. Gradually, the immediate fear of their return faded, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of daily life. What neither of them acknowledged openly was the subtle shift in their arrangement. The careful distance maintained at night grew smaller, conversations extended later into the evenings. Meals became occasions for sharing thoughts rather than mere sustenance. One evening in early December, as the first serious snow blanketed Silverdale, Jackson returned to the cabin to find Grace teaching Maria Gonzalez, one of her older students, to make tamales for the upcoming Christmas festivities. The small kitchen was warm and fragrant with spices, both women laughing as they worked. Jackson paused in the doorway, struck by the domesticity of the scene and the unfamiliar contentment it stirred in him. "Jackson," Grace smiled when she noticed him. "Perfect timing, we need someone to taste our efforts." Maria, a shy 15-year-old whose family had moved north from New Mexico territory the previous year, ducked her head in greeting. "They are my grandmother's recipe, Mr. Quinn." Jackson hung his coat and hat, stamping snow from his boots before approaching the table where the women worked. "Smells better than anything I could manage." As they shared the meal together, with Maria proudly explaining each step of the recipe, Jackson found himself studying Grace's animated expressions, the way her hands moved expressively as she spoke, the genuine interest she showed in Maria's cultural traditions. After walking Maria home through the snow, they returned to the warmth of their cabin. Grace busied herself cleaning the kitchen while Jackson built up the fire in the small stove. "You're good with the children," he observed.
Teaching seems to suit you.
Grace smiled over her shoulder. "I've always loved learning," Sharing that with others is a joy I didn't expect to find out here. Did you teach back in New York? Jackson asked, realizing how little he actually knew about her life before Montana. The question dimmed her smile slightly. No, my father believed education for women was primarily to make them attractive marriage prospects. I studied literature, art, music, all the ornamental subjects befitting a society daughter. Her voice took on a bitter edge. Nothing that would allow me actual independence. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, watching her methodical movements as she washed dishes. Yet here you are, supporting yourself quite capably. Only after running away with what little money I could gather, Grace admitted. The first year was difficult. I worked as a seamstress in Chicago, then as a hotel maid in St. Louis. I took whatever positions allowed me to study in my free time until I qualified for a teaching certificate. The revelation of these struggles stirred something protective in Jackson. You never considered returning, even when things were difficult. Grace set down the dish she was drying, her expression resolute. Never. I would rather scrub floors for the rest of my life than be sold into marriage with Everett Preston. Was he truly so terrible? Jackson asked carefully. He was my father's business partner, Grace said, her voice tight. 53 years old when I was 17. His first wife died in childbirth. His second fell down the stairs after what servants described as a disagreement. But he had shipping interests my father wanted access to, so my comfort and safety were deemed acceptable currency. The Stark assessment hung in the air between them. Jackson crossed the small kitchen and without thinking took her hand in his. No one will force you into anything again, he said quietly, not while I'm alive. Grace looked up at him, surprise and something deeper reflected in her eyes. This arrangement between us was supposed to be temporary, she reminded him softly, a means to an end. And is that still what you want? Jackson asked, surprised by how much her answer mattered. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Jackson released her hand and moved quickly to the small table where his revolver rested, motioning for Grace to stay back. Who's there? He called, approaching the door cautiously. Sheriff Miller, came the gruff response. Need a word with you and the Mrs. Quinn. Jackson opened the door to find the sheriff stamping snow from his boots, his expression grim. Evening, Sheriff, what brings you out in this weather? Miller stepped inside, nodding to Grace before turning serious eyes to Jackson. Got word from the sheriff over in Helena. 3 men matching the description of those fellows who confronted you at the schoolhouse were asking questions about a teacher named Zanetti. When told there was no such person, they started describing Grace to anyone who'd listen. Grace paled, one hand going instinctively to the leather bracelet she still wore. They're still looking. Seems so, Miller confirmed. Thought you should know they haven't given up. They were headed this way as of yesterday. Jackson's mind raced through the implications. They'll discover she's married when they arrive. That should end their pursuit. Miller scratched his beard doubtfully. Maybe. Unless they decide to question the validity of that marriage, or worse. The unspoken concern hung heavily in the room. Men willing to pursue a woman across multiple territories for money might not be deterred by legal niceties like marriage certificates. We'll be vigilant, Jackson assured the sheriff. Thank you for the warning. After Miller departed, Grace sank into a chair, her earlier animation replaced by weary resignation. It never ends. They'll keep coming until Preston gets what he wants or spends his fortune trying. Jackson knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. We'll face this together, Grace. I made you a promise. She met his gaze, vulnerability clear in her expression. I never intended to bring this danger to your door. This was supposed to be a simple arrangement. Nothing about you has been simple from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, Jackson said, a small smile softening his words. The truth of that statement hung between them, acknowledgement of how their arrangement had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Whatever response Grace might have made was lost as Jackson leaned forward, drawn by an impulse he no longer wanted to resist, and kissed her. Unlike their brief wedding kiss, this was neither tentative nor performed for appearances. Grace's initial surprise quickly gave way to response, her hands moving to frame his face as the kiss deepened, expressing months of unspoken feelings. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. I should apologize, he murmured. Please don't, Grace replied softly. Unless you regret it. The only thing I regret, Jackson said, meeting her eyes, is that it took the threat of danger to make me acknowledge what I've felt for weeks." Grace's smile was radiant despite the circumstances. "And what is it that you feel, Jackson Quinn?" "That this stopped being a convenient arrangement the moment you made this cabin feel like home," he answered honestly. "That I find myself thinking about you when we're apart. That the thought of Reeves or anyone else threatening you makes me want to break every vow of nonviolence I've ever made." Grace laughed softly, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "That's quite a declaration from a man who claimed to prefer solitude." "I was wrong about a great many things," Jackson admitted. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his embrace. "Starting with the belief that connections only led to pain." They stood holding each other as the snow continued to fall outside, the small cabin warm against the winter night. Whatever came with the morning, Reeves and his men, Preston's claims, the challenges of the frontier, they would face it together, their marriage of convenience transformed into something neither had dared hope for. 3 days later, Reeves rode into Silverdale with 4 men instead of the original 2, their expressions grim as they dismounted in front of the saloon. Word spread quickly through town, reaching the schoolhouse where Grace was dismissing her students for the day. Jackson, who had taken to meeting her after school since the sheriff's warning, arrived to find Grace calmly gathering her books while keeping the children inside. "They're here," he said without preamble. "5 of them this time." Grace's composed expression revealed only a slight tightening around her eyes. "The children should go directly home. Will you help me ensure they all leave safely?" Jackson nodded, impressed by her calm in the face of danger. Together, they organized the students into groups based on where they lived, with the older boys escorting younger children in the directions furthest from the saloon. Once the last child had departed, Grace finally allowed her composure to slip slightly. "What do they want? Surely they've learned I'm married by now." "They're drinking in the saloon," Jackson replied. "Sheriff Miller is keeping an eye on them. My guess is they're working up courage or waiting for nightfall." Grace gathered her shawl around her shoulders, her decision clear in her expression. "Then we should confront them now in public, before they can plan anything underhanded."
Grace, that's too dangerous.
"More dangerous than waiting for them to come to our home in the dark," she challenged. "I've been running for 2 years, Jackson. I won't spend my life looking over my shoulder." The determination in her voice forestalled further argument. Jackson recognized the same courage that had first drawn him to her, the refusal to be victimized, no matter the odds. "Together, then," he agreed, offering his arm, "but we do this carefully with the sheriff present." They walked arm in arm toward town, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Word of their approach preceded them, and by the time they reached the main street, several townspeople had positioned themselves strategically nearby, Walter at his forge, Tommy cleaning a non-existent window at the general store, 2 ranchers coincidentally checking supplies at the feed store. Sheriff Miller met them outside the saloon, his expression grave. "You sure about this? They've been drinking heavily." "Better to face them directly," Grace said firmly. Jackson squeezed her hand. "Stay behind me when we enter." The saloon fell silent as they stepped through the swinging doors. Reeves and his men occupied a corner table, whiskey bottles and glasses scattered before them. They looked up with expressions ranging from surprise to malicious satisfaction. "Well, well," Reeves drawled, rising unsteadily to his feet, "if it isn't the runaway bride herself." "Saved us the trouble of hunting you down, Miss Zanetti." "It's Mrs. Quinn now," Jackson corrected, his voice leveled despite the tension coiling in his muscles. Sheriff Miller positioned himself near the bar, hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. Reeves snorted derisively. "A convenient fiction, I'm sure. Mr. Preston was quite clear about your resourcefulness." His gaze shifted to Grace. "A marriage of convenience won't void the contract your father signed." "Preston has lawyers prepared to challenge it." "My father is dead," Grace said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent saloon. "Any contract he signed died with him, especially one arranging the marriage of his adult daughter without her consent." "That's not for you to decide," one of Reeves' companions interjected. $1,000 is what Preston's offering, and we mean to collect." Jackson took a step forward, forcing Reeves to look up at him. "My wife isn't for sale or collection. Whatever arrangement you had with her father is null and void." "I suggest you finish your drinks and leave Silverdale." The tension in the room was palpable. Every man present recognized the precipice they stood upon, violence only a wrong word or sudden movement away. Reeves' hand drifted toward his holster. You willing to die for a woman you barely know, Cowboy? I know her better than you ever will, Jackson replied evenly, and yes, I am. The stillness that followed was broken by Sheriff Miller's deliberate footsteps as he approached the table. Gentlemen, this is a peaceful town. I'd take it kindly if you respect that fact and settle your business without bloodshed. Reeves glared at the sheriff, clearly calculating his odds. 5 armed men against a sheriff, a cowboy, and whatever townspeople might intervene. There's nothing to settle, Grace said, stepping forward to stand beside Jackson. She pulled back her sleeve, revealing the leather bracelet and the crescent-shaped mark beneath it. This mark, which my father used to identify me, is also my proof that I am free of his control. She unclasped the bracelet, holding it up for all to see. My mother gave me this before she died, telling me that I was my own person, not my father's property. I have honored her words by making my own choices, including whom I would marry. The simple dignity of her declaration seemed to affect even Reeves, whose expression flickered with momentary uncertainty. Preston won't accept this, he said, though with less conviction. Then Mr. Preston is welcome to come to Silverdale himself, Sheriff Miller interjected, though I should warn him that we take a dim view of men who try to force themselves on unwilling women in this territory. The balance of power had shifted subtly. Reeves looked around the saloon, noting the hard expressions on the faces of the townspeople who had gathered. Whatever easy victory he had anticipated was clearly not forthcoming. This isn't over, he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow. It is for today, Miller replied firmly. I'll escort you and your men to the edge of town. I suggest you don't return. The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with the sullen departure of Reeves and his companions, shadowed by Sheriff Miller and several armed townsmen to ensure they left Silverdale's boundaries. Grace and Jackson remained in the saloon as the tension gradually dissipated, townspeople approaching to offer support and reassurance. You think they're gone for good? Jackson asked quietly as they finally walked home through the gathering dusk. Grace shook her head, her expression thoughtful. Not entirely. But each time they're turned away, Preston's determination will wane. $1,000 is significant, but not worth dying for. Jackson drew her closer against the winter chill. And what about us? Is our convenient fiction still just that? Grace stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the fading light. I think we both know it's become much more. The question is, what do you want it to be? I want it to be real, Jackson said simply. Not for show or protection, but because I've come to care for you in ways I never expected. The smile that illuminated Grace's face was answer enough, but she spoke the words he needed to hear. It already is real, Jackson. It has been for some time now. Their kiss, witnessed only by the first evening stars appearing above the Montana mountains, sealed a transformation neither had anticipated when they'd entered their arrangement months before. What had begun as protection had become partnership. What had started as convenience had grown into love. That night, for the first time, they truly shared the bed as husband and wife, the last barriers between them dissolving in tenderness and discovered passion. Spring arrived in Silverdale with the gradual greening of the valley and the birth of new calves on the surrounding ranches. The town had expanded slightly over the winter, with 2 new businesses opening on the main street and several families settling in the fertile bottomlands along the creek. Jackson and Grace had fallen into a rhythm of shared life that suited them both. He continued breaking horses for neighboring ranches while beginning construction on a modest home of their own on a small parcel of land he'd purchased at the edge of town. She taught at the schoolhouse during the day and spent evenings helping design their future home or reading aloud, while Jackson worked on furniture for the new house. No further word had come of Reeves or Preston, though occasionally a stranger passing through town would trigger momentary vigilance. Gradually, the threat receded from their daily thoughts, replaced by the comfortable certainty of their life together. On a warm Saturday in May, Jackson returned from delivering a newly trained horse to find Grace sitting on their small porch, a letter in her hands and an unreadable expression on her face. What is it? He asked, immediately alert to her unusual stillness. Grace looked up, a complex mix of emotions in her eyes. A letter from New York. Everett Preston is dead. Jackson sat beside her, taking the letter and quickly scanning its contents. The missive from a legal firm in New York formally notified Grace Zanetti Quinn that Everett Preston had succumbed to heart failure the previous month. Furthermore, it stated that in his final days, Preston had nullified all claims against her and had surprisingly left her a modest sum as recompense for difficulties caused.
It's over, Grace said softly. Truly over. Jackson set the letter aside, taking her hands in his. How do you feel? Relieved, she admitted, but also strangely sad for a man who lived and died so bitter that he would pursue a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. She leaned against Jackson's shoulder. It makes me all the more grateful for what we've found. They sat together as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land that had become their home. In the distance, the framework of their new house stood partly completed, a promise of the future they were building together. I have something to tell you as well, Grace said after a comfortable silence. She placed one of his hands gently against her abdomen, her eyes meeting his with quiet joy. We're going to have a child. The news washed through Jackson like a sunrise, illuminating parts of himself he hadn't known existed. The man who had once believed that attachments only led to pain now found himself overwhelmed with happiness at the prospect of new connections, the ultimate commitment of bringing a child into the world. A family, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Our family. Grace nodded, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. Our family. As twilight settled over Silverdale, they remained on the porch, planning their future with the quiet certainty of people who had found their way home, not to a place but to each other. The mark on Grace's wrist, once a means of identifying a daughter who had fled, had ultimately led to the love neither of them had been looking for but both had desperately needed. Jackson Quinn, who had once believed the frontier was no place for love, now understood that it was precisely in the harshest landscapes that love mattered most. And Grace Zanetti Quinn, who had fled across a continent to escape being owned, had discovered that freely giving her heart was the greatest expression of the independence she had always sought. Their journey had begun with a cowboy noticing a mark on a woman's wrist. It would continue with the family they created together in the Montana mountains, their love story becoming part of the tapestry of the American West, a testament to the quiet courage of those who dared to believe that even on the frontier, the human heart could find its true home.